Hello. Well, this is a good time for us to begin to talk about, in this chapter 7, outcome evaluation and impact evaluations. I hope you're really thinking about this because one of the assignments will be for this course will be developing a policy of our own. So many of the items that we've talked about in reference to Mears in his book and some other items that you're going to see will be very helpful. So keep all of this in mind. So anyway, let's get into chapter 7, see what we have there that we can highlight for you and that you can key on as you do your reading. Chapter 7 deals with what we come to know as outcome evaluations and impact evaluations. This chapter describes how outcome and impact evaluations differ. Then it focuses particular attention on impact evaluation because these ultimately provide the foundation for demonstrating policy effectiveness more convincingly. And you'll see this on page 168 as you get into the chapter. Outcome and impact evaluations are step 4 in the hierarchy. Outcome evaluations describe the types and levels of outcome associated with a particular policy. Impact evaluations go one more step or one step further by establishing whether a policy not only is associated with the outcome, but also whether it actually produces or causes them. Outcome evaluations do not allow us to make causal claims. We want an evaluation research approach that can help establish that a policy creates an intended outcome. An outcome evaluation provides the initial ground for making causal claims, but provides little to no comparative framework for establishing causality. By contrast, impact evaluations directly establish whether a policy produces specific outcomes and does so by using control groups or conditions. Outcome evaluations do not allow for causal claims. So we're going to keep all this in mind as we begin to move through the chapter. The benefits of outcome evaluations are useful and important because they prompt policymakers and criminal justice administrators to clarify the relevant criteria for identifying policy effectiveness. With an implementation evaluation, we establish accountability by showing that expected activities, services, or practices were undertaken as intended. With outcome evaluation, we establish it by showing that the outcomes have or have not occurred. And you'll see some of this on page 171. Outcome is the state of the target population or the social conditions that a policy is expected to have changed. It differs from an output, which typically refers to the services or activities undertaken by a policy. Now, you don't want to keep those in mind, an outcome and an output. And we'll go back through this a little bit later on. For instances, the training of inmates in terms of how to interview would be an output, whereas the outcomes would include learning to interview and whether they obtained jobs or committed additional crimes later. Okay, so a little bit of difference there. Mears goes into details about in-programs outcomes and after programs outcomes. He makes a distinction between these concepts, especially when he addresses prisoner reentry initiatives. And for those of you who met Dr. Slager, you know that's her area, prison reentry. So I'm sure you're getting plenty of that in other courses. Mears says that there is an overlap between implementation evaluation and outcome evaluation. He says that the overlap is reflected in the performance monitoring efforts, typically involving tracking measures of both. In this chapter, Mears addresses two basic methodologies for assessing whether a policy produces an impact. They are experiment and quasi-experiment. And of course, you know, in sociology, we really don't do a lot of experiments. We do more survey type of research. But anyway, Mears says, he talks about this. He says, Mears spends some time describing both processes. He declares that the aim of an experiment is to show that an intervention is produced or did not produce a specific level of change in an outcome. So again, when you keep in mind about think about the experiment, it's going to be introducing something, introducing the stimuli. And again, we don't do very much of that in sociology or criminal justice, but it is a technique of research. Although experiments appear to be favored in impact evaluation, Mears note that experiments can also be problematic to use. First, he says experiments may lead us to focus on policies with more certain but also smaller returns. In other words, those policies or those experiments that we do may actually distract us from doing what we really want to do. So that'll be something to hold on to. Second, he says experiments can be costly and run for many years. Third, ethical conditions may impact the limitation of experiments. 4, experiment may be poorly implemented. Finally, he says that impact evaluations conducted under laboratory-like conditions may promise unrealistic results. And of course, that's what they are. They're experiments, so they're not necessarily reality focused. There may be some kind of like hypothetical situations. Okay, so keep that in mind. Regardless of the type of impact evaluation undertaken, attention to methodological rigor allows us to have a greater trust in the results. And that's what's been stressed here in Chapter 7, and that is getting some sense of the outcome, the output, and those kinds of things. So you really want to hold on to that, especially as I said earlier, since you're going to have to develop a policy of your own before this course is over with. Okay?